Hello, hello, and welcome to our next system. We will now be considering the muscular system with an introduction to muscular tissue. In this chapter, we will quickly review the structure and function of the three types of muscular tissue. So that's skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. We will then look at the anatomy and physiology of skeletal muscle in more detail, which is the main focus of this chapter. In doing so, we will consider the events at the neuromuscular junction, and that is where neurons signal skeletal muscle contraction. We'll also explain the physiology of skeletal muscle contraction and relaxation, and we'll look at the energy use in muscles. Muscle cells are very metabolic, so we'll look at the sources of ATP for muscle contraction, and we'll quickly look at how muscle tension is controlled. So here's an overview of the chapter. So we mentioned some of these already. Going down towards the end, we'll look at the effect of exercise on skeletal muscle tissue, how muscle tissue is regenerated. We've talked about that a little bit with respect to specialized tissues having a decreased capacity for regeneration, but an increased capacity for hypertrophy. We'll look at how skeletal muscle tissue develops, and of course, we always conclude by looking at the effects of aging on our tissue and system. Here is a table summarizing the three types of muscular tissue. It's very similar to the table we provided for the Chapter 4 content on tissues. So quickly, skeletal muscle is attached to the bone, cardiac muscle is found in the wall of the heart, and visceral or smooth muscle is found in the wall of various organs, the viscera, essentially. Functions now. Skeletal muscle attaches to bone and creates the force to move the bones at joints. Cardiac muscle, of course, pumps blood. And the visceral muscle has various functions depending on where it is located. So in the digestive tract, it's responsible for peristalsis and other forms of movement as well as mixing actions. In the urinary bladder, contraction of the smooth muscle there is responsible for urination. Smooth muscle also forms the internal sphincters of the urinary and digestive tracts. In terms of appearance of the cells of these tissues, skeletal muscle cells are called fibers because they are long, fibrous type structures. They are multinucleated and have visible lines called striations. Cardiac muscle cells have one or two nuclei, so they're uni or binucleated. They also have visible striations, and the cells are connected by intercalated discs that allow electrical impulses to flow easily from one cell to the other so that the chambers of the heart receive the signal to contract as units. With visceral or smooth muscle, there is one nucleus, and this muscle is very different. It has no striations, and the cells here are shorter spindle-shaped cells. With respect to neural function, skeletal muscle is voluntarily controlled, so we have conscious control over the activity of our skeletal muscles. Cardiac muscle is involuntarily controlled. We cannot control our heart rate or force of contraction. Neither can we control the rate and force of the contraction of smooth muscle in our viscera. The next few slides provide an overview of muscular tissue. So again, skeletal muscle tissue is so named because the muscles are attached to the bones of the skeletal system that cause movement. So we'll look at the arrangement of muscles as they attach to bones across joints and how that leads to movement in the next chapter. Skeletal muscle tissue has visible striations or alternating light and dark bands, which are visible under a microscope. Skeletal muscle tissue works mainly in a voluntary manner in that it can be controlled consciously by an area of your brain called the primary motor cortex located in your cerebrum. However, many skeletal muscles are also controlled subconsciously or automatically to some extent, and the activity of these muscles subconsciously is important for breathing. For example, the diaphragm is a large skeletal muscle that we have conscious control over. That's why we can control our breathing. However, the diaphragm must contract subconsciously and regularly in order for you to breathe consistently. So it's a good thing that that is not left up to us to control, or we'd stop breathing. We also have subconscious control of the muscles responsible for posture and maintaining balance. Cardiac muscle tissue is found only in one place in the body, only in the heart. It makes up about 95% of the thickness of the wall of the heart. It has visible striations like skeletal muscle. However, the cells have a different shape. They tend to be branched and connected by intercalated discs that allow electrical impulses to travel quickly from cell to cell so that the regions of the heart contract as a unit. That contraction is involuntary, so we do not control it. However, there are specialized cells in the heart that create autorhythmic contraction. So like your diaphragm, the muscles of the heart contract rhythmically, and that is initiated from a node of special tissue called the pacemaker located in the right atrium of your heart. Finally, we have the smooth muscle tissue, which is located in the walls of hollow internal structures, such as your blood vessels, where they are responsible for constriction and dilation as the smooth muscle contracts and relaxes, respectively. We also have smooth muscle that make up the airways of the respiratory tract, responsible for bronchoconstriction when the smooth muscle contracts, or bronchodilation and opening when the smooth muscle relaxes. We also have smooth muscle, my goodness, everywhere, along the length of the digestive tract. Where else? Urinary tract. Smooth muscle in the skin make up the erector pili structures, etc. Smooth muscle cells lack striations, and the cells have a spindle shape. And again, smooth muscle is controlled involuntarily. So taken together, here's an overview of the functions of muscular tissue. You should be able to link a specific type of muscular tissue to each of these functions. For example, producing body movements such as walking and running is the activity of skeletal muscle, as is stabilizing body positions and maintaining posture. Moving substances within the body is created by cardiac muscle in the heart, which moves blood, and then the smooth muscle in the rest of the viscera moves substances through the tracts, for example, food and secretions through the digestive tract. In the respiratory tract, the smooth muscle regulates the amount of air that flows in and out of the lungs. Generating heat occurs with contraction of muscles. So as muscles contract and as they produce ATP, they produce heat. For example, shivering is subconscious activation and relaxation of the skeletal muscles to generate heat as ATP is produced to power those contractions. But all skeletal muscles, as they produce and use ATP, all muscles, as they contract and use ATP, are also generating heat. Here we have the properties of all muscular tissue, and these properties enable muscle tissue to function and contribute to homeostasis. Number one is excitability. We have heard this before. Excitability is a property of both muscular and nervous tissue. It is the ability to respond to certain stimuli by generating electrical impulses. Those impulses are sometimes called electrical signals, and scientifically they are called action potentials. And this is a very important concept with respect to cellular physiology, so we will introduce you to it in this chapter and elaborate more on it when we get to the nervous system. But all muscular tissue can respond to stimuli by generating electrical impulses. Secondly, we have contractility. This is the ability of the tissue to contract forcefully when stimulated by those electrical impulses. And contractility is the ability to generate force, a pulling force when stimulated. Note that contractility may or may not create movement. It depends on what forces need to be overcome or what the resistance is. Also, when muscles contract, they may shorten, they may stay the same length, or they may also lengthen depending on what forces are opposing that contraction. So we will revisit that concept later on. But contractility is the ability of muscular tissue to contract forcefully when stimulated. Thirdly, we have extensibility. This is the ability of the tissue to stretch within certain limits without being damaged. The connective tissues within the muscle limit the range of extensibility. We saw that with the collagen fibers. Normally, smooth muscle has the greatest ability for extensibility. Think of what happens when you eat a large meal and the wall of your stomach, which is mainly the muscle tissue, is stretched or distended. Okay, that's extensibility. Think of how your bladder can hold up to 800 milliliters of urine. And if you really hold it or force it, over a liter. That requires a lot of stretching or extensibility of those organs containing this muscular tissue. Thankfully, the fourth property is also present, where after being extended, muscular tissue has elasticity, which is the ability to return to the original length and shape after contraction or extension. The focus of this chapter is skeletal muscle tissue. So here we have a diagram of the anatomy of skeletal muscle tissue. Please note all the labels which are elaborated on in the following slides. But to give you an overview, note that skeletal muscle is the muscle that is attached to bone. And muscles attached to bone through bands of connective tissue that make up the tendon. Now, tendons are actually extensions of 3 layers of connective tissue found in individual muscles. So we're looking at the gross anatomy, the anatomy of a muscle organ. For example, the bicep brachii muscle here attaching to the radius, as well as the scapula more proximally. So here, surrounding the entire muscle is a connective tissue layer called the epimysium, and this binds all the structures together. Deep to the epimysium, we have individual bundles of muscle fibers. The bundle is called a fascicle, and each fascicle is surrounded by a connective tissue layer called the perimysium. So perimysium binds several muscle fibers together into a bundle called a fascicle. Then, in this diagram, a separate or individual fascicle is enlarged on the bottom left. So you can see the fascicle with its perimysium, and a fascicle is a bundle of individual muscle fibers. Now we call them muscle fibers because muscle cells are very elongated. So instead of calling them cells, they get the special name fibers, muscle fibers. But a muscle fiber is a muscle cell or skeletal myocyte. Each skeletal muscle fiber is surrounded by its own individual sheath of connective tissue called the endomysium. So let's go from smaller to larger now. Each muscle cell or fiber is surrounded by endomysium. Several fibers with their endomysium are bundled together in fascicles, which are surrounded by perimysium. And then several fascicles with their perimysium, along with blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves, are bundled together to form the entire muscle, and those are bundled together, and the entire muscle is surrounded by the most superficial connective tissue layer called the epimysium. Now, all 3 of those connective tissue layers extend beyond the muscle tissue itself, kind of like how a candy wrapper extends around a candy. If you think of the old-time candies maybe that a grandmother would give you, okay? Those little twisty ends of the wrapper, those would be the connective tissue layers that now form the tendon that attach the muscle to the bone. All right, going more microscopic. Within each muscle fiber, we have the structures of a cell. It has a plasma membrane. It has cytoplasm. It has mitochondria. It has endoplasmic reticulum and the other organelles of a typical cell, however, in different arrangements, in different quantities, and with special names. So, the plasma membrane of a skeletal muscle fiber is called the sarcolemma. Sarcolemma. And deep to the sarcolemma, which is a plasma membrane, you have the cytoplasm of the muscle cell called the sarcoplasm. Then we have the specialized organelles of contraction called myofibrils. And myofibrils are made up of different proteins arranged in filaments. So the next few slides will elaborate on this, and then we'll look at the microscopic anatomy of each muscle fiber. So here we have a summary of the various connective tissue components of skeletal muscle. A fascia is a dense sheet or broad band of irregular connective tissue, which is what makes up all of these connective tissues. But this is the one that surrounds and binds more than one muscle into a group. So we already met the epimysium, that is the outermost layer surrounding an entire muscle. However, several muscles can be bound together to form a group. For example, a fascia would bind together the four muscles that make up the quadriceps femoris group within your thigh or femoral region. So deep to the fascia, you'd have the epimysium that surrounds the individual muscles or the muscle organ. And the epimysium binds together several bundles of cells called fascicles and other tissues to make up the entire muscle. Deep to the epimysium, we have the perimysium that forms a fascicle of 10 to 100 muscle fibers. And again, the fascicles are bundled together by epimysium to make the entire muscle. Going deeper, we have the endomysium, which separates individual muscle fibers from one another. It surrounds an individual muscle fiber. And then the three connective tissue layers, epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, extend beyond the muscle to form the tendons that attach the muscles to the bone and also transmit the force of contraction created by the muscle tissue to the bone. Finally, we have an aponeurosis, which is a broad, flattened tendon. It provides a wide area of attachment for the muscles it surrounds. Skeletal muscle tissue is both highly innervated and vascularized. That means that skeletal muscle tissue has many nerves as well as blood vessels. The neurons that stimulate skeletal muscle to contract are called somatic motor neurons. Somatic refers to your skeletal muscles and the voluntarily controlled structures of the body. Motor refers to those signals that originate in the central nervous system, so the brain and spinal cord, and go out towards targets in the peripheral nervous system. In this case, the targets are the skeletal muscle cells. The axon of these neurons is a singular long process that branches several times, and these branches extend to different skeletal muscle fibers. So while each skeletal muscle fiber has only a single neuron branch signaling it, a motor unit consists of a single somatic motor neuron plus all of the skeletal muscle fibers that its branches stimulate. Besides this network of innervation, skeletal muscle tissue is also highly vascularized. Muscle tissue is highly metabolic, so it needs a constant supply of oxygen and nutrients for the synthesis of ATP to power both contraction and relaxation. So there are several capillaries associated with each muscle fiber. All right, on this diagram, we have the microscopic anatomy of skeletal muscle tissue. Beginning at the top left, muscle fibers develop through the fusion of several immature muscle cells called myoblasts. And as these myoblasts fuse together, they form multinucleated, elongated muscle cells called the muscle fibers. Some of those myoblasts remain immature and act as satellite cells within the muscle tissue that can divide and fuse with the pre-existing muscle fibers, for growth by hypertrophy. These satellite cells also proliferate and help to repair damaged muscle tissue. But again, skeletal muscle tissue is highly specialized, so technically this is growth through hypertrophy by enlarging the cells with fusion of the smaller myoblast cells. In the middle of the page, we have a single fascicle or fasciculus, which again is a bundle of muscle fibers surrounded by perimysium. They then isolate and enlarge for you one of the muscle fibers. So that's at the bottom of the slide on the left. You can see that it's surrounded by the outer sheath of endomysium. And then deep to the endomysium is the plasma membrane of the cell called the sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma is a plasma membrane of a muscle fiber. Deep to that, you have the intracellular components. So this is where you find the organelles. You'll see that there are several mitochondria suspended within the cytoplasm of the muscle cell called the sarcoplasm. Multiple mitochondria because muscle tissue is highly metabolic and has a high ATP requirement. You'll also see several nuclei, okay, from the fusion of the myoblast cells. And we have some special organelles unique to skeletal muscle tissue. Extensions of the sarcolemma into the inner regions of the cell are structures called transverse tubules or T-tubules. These transmit the electrical impulses that travel along the sarcolemma deep into the cell so that the signals can then reach the structures that store the calcium to be released to signal contraction. So the T-tubules essentially bring the electrical impulses from the surface of the cell in the sarcolemma to the deeper parts of the cell. Calcium is so important for muscle contraction. In relaxed muscles, calcium is stored in specialized endoplasmic reticulum structures called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And these are associated with the T-tubules so that when the electrical impulse travels along the sarcolemma and down the T-tubules, it opens up those calcium channels in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, releasing calcium for contraction. And then the bulk of the muscle is made up of these contractile organelles called myofibrils. So that's what's sticking out towards the right. Each myofibril is made up of repeating protein filaments or myofilaments. And these filaments include your thick filaments and your thin filaments. We will note which proteins make up each on the next slide. But here, the arrangement of thick and thin filaments create visible bands or lines called striations. All right, so they try to summarize this for you on the diagram on the right of the page. The blue line represents the sarcolemma or the plasma membrane, and the extensions or invaginations are your transverse T-tubules. They are associated with the SR, sarcoplasmic reticulum, that store the calcium inside relaxed, non-contracting muscle cells. Then within the cytoplasm, we also have the myofibrils, which are made up of repeating contractile regions called sarcomeres. We'll look at that in a bit. Also suspended in the sarcoplasm are mitochondria for ATP production under aerobic conditions. And speaking of aerobic conditions, oxygen is not only brought to these cells in the blood, but is also stored within the cells, bound to a protein called myoglobin. So myoglobin provides a ready supply of oxygen for these cells. It's very similar to hemoglobin in that it binds oxygen, but it's right within the muscle cell. And while the blood also brings glucose and other nutrients to the muscle cells for ATP synthesis, the muscle cells have their own internal stores of glucose in the form of, you know it, glycogen, which is stored in granules. We also have the proteins that attach the myofibrils to the sarcolemma, such as dystrophin, and we're going to meet some of these other proteins in the following slides. So the sarcolemma again, is the plasma membrane of the cell. It is what receives the signals for contraction and then responds. Remember, excitability responds by generating electrical impulses that travel down the transverse or T tubules to the interior of the cell. So these action potentials excite all parts of the muscle fiber at the same time by traveling down these two T tubules, which are associated with the sarcolemma. The sarcoplasm, again, is the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber, and it stores all the organelles. So we have glycogen, which is glucose for ATP synthesis, and a red-colored protein called myoglobin. So this contributes to the red color of meat, especially dark meat. So myoglobin releases oxygen when it is needed for ATP production. The myofibrils, again, are the thread-like structures, the contractile organelles of the cell. So these contain the proteins that interact to generate contractile force. The sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR, is a specialized endoplasmic reticulum. It's a membranous sac that surrounds and encircles each myofibril. These organelles store calcium when the muscle is relaxed and release calcium as triggered by those muscle action potentials. The release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the sarcoplasm is what is necessary to initiate contraction. We'll talk about that later. The myofilaments are the structures within the myofibrils that function in the contractile process. So they are protein filaments, thick and thin. The thick filaments are predominantly myosin protein, and the thin filaments is where you find the actin protein along with two regulatory proteins. The arrangement of the thick and thin filaments create repeating units along the length of the myofibrils called sarcomeres, and they are also responsible for the visible striations in skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle tissue.